Upon landing, this passenger disregarded the flight crew's order to honor a fallen soldier, stating loudly, "I couldn't care less about it." Little did he know that the person behind him would instantly make him regret uttering such a statement. "Sir, you have to wait." The flight attendant's voice cut through the chaos as the man, tall and rugged, pushed his way to the front of the aisle. "Move!" he snapped, his impatience overriding any sense of decorum. But she stood her ground, blocking his path with a firmness that matched his aggression. "This is a sensitive moment. We need to let the fallen soldier be escorted off first." He glared at her, clearly weighing whether to argue. Meanwhile, the other passengers were already on their feet, ignoring the pleas to remain seated. The tension in the cabin thickened as the plane taxied to the gate, and the gravity of the situation was lost on those desperate to leave. As the pilot's voice from the transmitter faded away, the flight attendants reiterated his request again, their voices firm but respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have a fallen soldier on board, a fallen airman. We ask you to remain seated as we pull into the gate so he can be escorted off the aircraft first." Unfortunately, their words fell on deaf ears. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the passengers' impatience grew. The fallen airman's escort, two somber-faced military officers, headed for the door. That was when things began to take a wild turn. In a matter of seconds, most of the passengers got on their feet and followed suit, ignoring the plea to remain seated. Among them was a man who had been fidgeting in his seat since takeoff from Phoenix. He was tall, had a rugged jawline, and appeared to be in his late 40s. He stood at the forefront of the aisle, next in line behind the fallen airman's escort, waiting to disembark. However, before he could rush out, a visibly upset flight attendant stopped him in his tracks. "You have to wait, sir," she said firmly, but politely. A hint of irritation flashed across his face as he stood face to face with the petite stewardess. Earlier on, he had a run-in with her, and his patience was wearing thin. With the journey finally over, he was eager to exit the plane quickly, just like the rest of the passengers behind him. Yet, this flight attendant stood in the way, adding to his already agitated state. That afternoon, as he stood before the door, he glanced around, seemingly annoyed that he was now the object of frustration for the impatient passengers who pushed against him. Irritated, he shot a glare at the stewardess, as if hoping it would scare her off and give him room to pass. But she remained undeterred, returning his glare with the same intensity while repeating her order to stay seated. "I couldn't care less, honestly," the man hissed at the lady, drawing a few disapproving glances from the passengers who overheard him. He didn't notice the attention he had unwittingly drawn to himself, especially from a certain fellow behind him. For the record, he didn't seem to care. All he wanted was to walk out of the plane. He had no idea that doing so would lead to a moment that would forever change his life. It was the summer of 2017, and the plane was bound for Detroit, carrying a precious cargo, the body of Sergeant Andre Taylor, an airman who was being transported back to his home in Michigan. As the passengers settled into their seats, the pilot's voice resounded over the intercom, his tone soft and somber. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special passenger on board today. We're honored to be transporting the remains of Sergeant Andre Taylor, who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We ask that you all remain respectful and silent during the flight." Sergeant Andre Taylor was an airman stationed at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. He was born in Lansing, Michigan, and served in the U.S. Air Force for 10 years, until he passed away at the age of 28. His family was working on bringing him home to Michigan so they could complete the final funeral preparations. It's not always the case that fallen soldiers are transported in grand style by cargo or Delta Force planes, as depicted in movies. They are sometimes flown home on regular commercial planes with people on board. This was precisely the case for the late Sergeant Taylor. His family, consisting of his mother, siblings and children, Adriana and Aidan, had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Their hearts were heavy with grief. They had said their goodbyes at the military base, surrounded by Sergeant Taylor's fellow soldiers, who played taps for the last time in his honor. Now, through this trip, they were one step closer to laying their beloved Andre to rest. Sergeant Andre Taylor was surrounded by love from everyone. His colleagues in the Air Force, his family, and even the flight crew who called for a solemn trip. However, not everyone on board shared this reverence for the fallen soldier. After the pilot had passed along his message, Mr. Johnson, a passenger in seat 17C, scoffed less than graciously. He found the information a bit unnecessary, as he was eager to get to his destination. Before takeoff, the pilot made another quick announcement about the need to maintain decorum during the trip with the fallen soldier's family on board, and still in mourning. The flight crew wanted to ensure a smooth experience for everyone on board. Yet Mr. Johnson still didn't share this sentiment, finding the special treatment excessive. The near 50-year-old man huffed in annoyance before grumbling under his breath, "What's the big deal?" Other people have their own problems to deal with. The words were muttered quickly, barely a whisper, making everyone around him miss it. Everyone, that is, except Martha, the petite stewardess who had been urging passengers to buckle up properly. A flicker of disgust flashed across her face for a millisecond before she expertly schooled her expression to one befitting a flight attendant. With a small smile on her face, she urged Mr. Johnson to switch off his phone and buckle up. In response, the man grumbled once again, yet did as instructed. For a brief moment, he caught Martha's subtle show of annoyance but chose to ignore it. He had a 4-hour flight ahead and wasn't in the mood for drama. Barely after takeoff, once everyone had settled down, the plane's engines roared to life and the vessel soared through the air in a matter of minutes. While in the air, the pilot's voice echoed through the intercom at intervals, reiterating his directive for the passengers to honor the late Sergeant Taylor. However, this time, his messages were for a different kind of tribute. 712. This time, his messages were for a different kind of tribute. Ladies and gentlemen, please listen to this announcement. Upon landing, we'll be asking you to remain seated until the body of Sergeant Taylor is respectfully removed from the aircraft. Following this announcement, the flight attendants often repeated the request, their eyes scanning the cabin with solemn determination. It was important that they set the right ambiance for the trip, so they went on routine checks around the cabin. Amidst this awe-inspiring moment, Mr. Johnson grew more disconcerted by the constant reminders. He digested the information with mild annoyance, without putting any effort into hiding his discomfort. His behavior didn't go unnoticed. Martha, who had been keeping a watchful eye on him, sensed his displeasure from a mile away. Quickly, she approached him with a warm smile, eager to determine the source of his discomfort. True to his usual self, Mr. Johnson wasted no time questioning the need for the constant reminders, citing them as excessive and unnecessary. The remark came off as a slight slap to Martha, yet she fought the urge to let her annoyance show. "Sir, I understand it may seem repetitive, but we have a lot of passengers on board who may not be paying attention," she explained, gesturing towards some passengers busy with magazines, while others watched movies or laughed at entertaining content on their phones. "We're only trying to create a respectful atmosphere for the family of Sergeant Taylor." Martha hoped her words were sensible enough to appeal to the inconsiderate man, but to her surprise, they didn't seem to have any effect on him. If anything, it only pushed him to utter more insensitive statements. Scoffing at her, he stated, "I don't see the point of such an extended gesture. After all, nobody's going to get up from their seats to dance or cheer suddenly." "It's a long trip, and we can't keep hearing this on and on, you know," he concluded, his eyes not betraying the irritation laced in his words. Martha's smile faltered, her mind reeling from what she had just heard. She took a few calming breaths to control herself, careful not to talk or act rashly that afternoon. Then, when she felt more in control, she finally gave a response, her voice polite but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir, but it's basic courtesy and protocol. So please, for the duration of the trip, do well to maintain a nice atmosphere and keep the peace." The exchange left a sour taste in Mr. Johnson's mouth, but he reluctantly agreed to comply for the rest of the trip. The flight crew repeated the reminder 4 times, especially as the mood in the plane began to look a little too unruly for comfort. At long last, their 4-hour trip finally came to a halt. Instead of letting the passengers disembark, Martha stood in Mr. Johnson's way. What Mr. Johnson hadn't realized was that the flight attendant was also internally fuming. They had been informed countless times during the trip to wait until Sergeant Andre Taylor's body was respectfully removed from the aircraft first. Yet here she was, trying to tame an arrogant man and a bunch of insensitive passengers who stood behind him. As if that wasn't enough disrespect, the man downplayed the sacredness of the entire display, stating he couldn't care less about it. His choice of words irked Martha more than she could admit. From the few glances she saw several passengers shoot at Mr. Johnson, she could tell that they shared her sentiments. Unable to control the increasingly agitated crowd walking down the aisle, Martha regretfully knew she had to relinquish her spot by the door. The young woman realized she was fighting a losing battle against Mr. Johnson and the other passengers. Moreover, if she continued to stop them, she risked worsening the situation, allowing oblivious passengers to ruin the sacredness of the entire procedure. Mr. Johnson saw how her resolve was helplessly waning and smirked, finding the sight delightful. Although they never had a full-on confrontation that day, he was overcome with the urge to spite her for trying to talk down to him. Seeing her crumble after putting up a bold front was a blessing to him. Little did he know, he had another problem on his plate that was more deserving of his time and effort. You see, after he uttered those insensitive words, inaudible to most, they caught the attention of someone behind him. That person was Ken Fitzgerald, a retired airman who also worked as an airline staff member. Having been in the Air Force, he knew how sacred this moment was, not just for the fallen soldier who had served his country, but also for his family, who brought him home to lay to rest. Fitzgerald's eyes were fixed on Mr. Johnson's head the minute he uttered his insensitive remark. Seated quietly, following the directive to remain silent and respectful upon landing, Fitzgerald never expected the passengers to act so discourteously, despite the numerous pleas. He watched as a woman shunned Mr. Johnson for his rude remark, citing it as an insult to the deceased and those who took the time to honor him. The woman, seated not far from Mr. Johnson, had visible grey strands of hair scattered around, indicating her age, yet Mr. Johnson did not find her advice worth his attention. Instead, he shrugged it off arrogantly before facing the stewardess once again. Mr. Johnson was about to exit the plane when Fitzgerald decided that he couldn't let this behavior slide. Taking a deep breath, he called out to Mr. Johnson, aiming to address him not as an airline staff member, but as a fellow citizen and veteran. "Excuse me, sir, but you can't act like that," Fitzgerald called out from where he was sitting, hoping to get Mr. Johnson's attention. However, just like the others who had spoken to him, Mr. Johnson looked over his shoulder in the most casual way possible, before blatantly ignoring him. Through this act, he never gave Fitzgerald the chance to properly educate him on what he was doing wrong. Before more could be said on the matter, Mr. Johnson exited the plane, leaving behind a host of unresolved tensions. Fitzgerald was flabbergasted by the sheer display of disregard he had just witnessed, not just from Mr. Johnson, but also from the other passengers who had disembarked, while Sergeant Taylor's family wept over the casket. Feeling the flames of anger and disappointment burn within him, Fitzgerald decided that he would make sure Mr. Johnson and the other discourteous passengers understood the gravity of their actions and the respect due to Sergeant Taylor and his family. 7:15. His family had already endured enough heartache without witnessing the disrespect shown by those who should have shared in honoring their fallen loved one. As Mr. Johnson disappeared into the crowd outside, Fitzgerald rose from his seat, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just witnessed. With every step toward the plane's exit, his mind raced through memories of comrades lost, funerals attended, and moments of silent reflection shared by those who understood the cost of service. He thought of the times when the smallest gesture, like standing still for a flag-draped casket, meant the world to grieving families. When he reached the door, Fitzgerald glanced toward the tarmac where the honor guard had assembled. 6 soldiers, in sharp, pristine uniforms, stood at attention beside the hearse. The flag covering Sergeant Taylor's coffin fluttered gently in the wind as they prepared to receive it. Nearby, Sergeant Taylor's mother stood, a frail woman supported by 2 younger relatives. Tears flowed freely down her face, her body trembling with the grief she carried. In her eyes, Fitzgerald saw not just sorrow, but also an indescribable pride. A mother who had given everything. The sight brought a lump to Fitzgerald's throat. His gaze shifted back to the plane, and the sting of anger returned. How could anyone witness such a profound moment and not feel moved to respect it? Determined, Fitzgerald decided it wasn't enough to let this pass unchallenged. He stepped off the plane and spotted one of the airline's supervisors nearby. With quiet resolve, he approached. "Excuse me," he began, catching the supervisor's attention. "My name is Ken Fitzgerald. I used to serve in the Air Force, and I work with the airline now. I just want to bring something to your attention about what happened on board." The supervisor, a middle-aged woman with a serious yet empathetic demeanor, looked at him with concern. "Go ahead, sir. What's on your mind?" Fitzgerald took a breath, recounting what he had witnessed. The dismissive comments, the disrespect from Mr. Johnson, and the passengers who had ignored the repeated requests for decorum during such a solemn moment. He explained that it wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about honoring the dignity of those who sacrificed everything. "I don't know what the company's policy is on these kinds of incidents," Fitzgerald said, his voice firm but respectful. "But I think it's important that we, as airline staff, make sure this kind of disrespect doesn't go unnoticed. Maybe it's a letter or something formal, but I think we owe it to the family and to Sergeant Taylor." The supervisor nodded, her expression grave. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Fitzgerald. We strive to uphold these moments with the highest respect, and it's clear that some passengers fell short today. I'll make sure we escalate this matter. We'll have to review how we handle these situations in the future." Fitzgerald felt a small measure of relief, though it didn't completely ease the frustration in his chest. "Thank you. It means a lot to me. To all of us, really." The supervisor placed a hand on his arm. "I'll make sure this gets handled. And thank you for your service, Mr. Fitzgerald." With that, Fitzgerald walked away, his eyes drifting back to the hearse. He stood a moment longer, watching as the soldiers solemnly lifted Sergeant Taylor's casket and began the slow, deliberate march toward the waiting vehicle. Every step they took resonated with the weight of honor and duty. Fitzgerald knew that some lessons, unfortunately, had to be learned the hard way. He could only hope that the people like Mr. Johnson, in their obliviousness or arrogance, would one day come to understand the profound meaning behind these gestures of respect. Maybe it would take another moment like this for them to get it, or maybe they'd never understand at all. But for Fitzgerald, and for those who did, such moments would always matter. And for Sergeant Taylor's family, that respect, however delayed or neglected by some, would remain unshakable in the hearts of those who truly knew its worth. As Fitzgerald turned to leave the airport, he hoped the tribute given to Sergeant Taylor however marred by a few, had at least brought some comfort to those who needed it most, the ones who would carry his memory forward. 7:45. Forward with the weight of loss, but also with the support of countless strangers who, through Fitzgerald's efforts, had come to learn about Sergeant Andre Taylor's sacrifice. Over the next few days, the story of the flight spread rapidly, thanks to Fitzgerald's video post and his heartfelt message about respect, military customs, and the importance of honoring the fallen. People from all walks of life, military personnel, veterans, families, and even civilians who had no direct connection to the armed forces, began to share their thoughts on the incident. Comments poured in on social media, many expressing outrage at the disrespect shown on the flight, while others shared their gratitude for the lessons learned. A few even admitted they might not have fully understood the significance of such a ceremony before, but now they did. Fitzgerald's message hit home for many. Respect wasn't just about rules or traditions, it was about empathy and understanding, especially in moments when a family was mourning the loss of a loved one who had given everything for their country. Sergeant Taylor's family, particularly his sister Tiffany, was overwhelmed by the response. In an interview that followed the viral spread of Fitzgerald's post, she spoke openly about the deep pain her family had endured, but also about the comfort they felt in knowing that her brother's story had touched so many lives. "My brother was a humble man," Tiffany said. "He never sought recognition for what he did, but he always believed in doing the right thing, no matter what. To see so many people come together to honor him, even after what happened on that flight, it's been a blessing in disguise." Meanwhile, the airline also took swift action in response to the public outcry. In a formal statement, the company apologized to Sergeant Taylor's family and thanked Ken Fitzgerald for bringing the issue to their attention. They vowed to implement new policies for handling situations involving fallen soldiers, ensuring that all passengers would be fully briefed on the importance of respecting such moments before, during, and after the flight. As for Mr. Johnson, the consequences of his behavior didn't end with the public backlash. After the company he worked for reviewed the video footage and heard accounts from witnesses, they decided that a formal reprimand wasn't enough. He was suspended from his position with an ultimatum: attend sensitivity training and issue a formal apology to Sergeant Taylor's family or face termination. At first, Mr. Johnson was defiant, refusing to acknowledge his role in the incident. But as the public pressure mounted, and after receiving dozens of messages from veterans and military families who were deeply offended by his actions, something changed. In a rare moment of reflection, Johnson penned a letter to Tiffany and her family. In the letter, he apologized for his behavior on the plane, admitting that he had been impatient and inconsiderate. He explained that he had been so caught up in his own frustrations that he hadn't stopped to think about what the moment meant for Sergeant Taylor's family or the other passengers on board. "I realize now that my actions were not just rude, they were deeply disrespectful," Mr. Johnson wrote. "I cannot undo what I did, but I hope you can accept my apology. I will carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life." Tiffany, ever the gracious one, accepted the apology on behalf of her family, though the wound of that day would never fully heal. Still, she expressed hope that Mr. Johnson had learned something from the experience, and that moving forward, he might show more understanding and respect in such situations. As time went on, the story became less about the disrespect shown on that plane, and more about the broader lessons learned. Fitzgerald's video continued to circulate, becoming a teaching tool for military organizations, airlines, and even schools. The focus shifted to the importance of honoring those who served, and to the small but significant ways people could show their gratitude and respect. Sergeant Taylor's legacy lived on, not just in the hearts of his family and fellow service members, but in the minds of countless people who had learned from that fateful flight. His memory became a symbol of what it means to truly honor sacrifice, not just in grand ceremonies or public displays, but in everyday actions, in the quiet moments when we choose to stand still, pay respect, and recognize the cost of freedom. For Ken Fitzgerald, life returned to its normal rhythm, though he often thought back to that day. He didn't see himself as a hero, or even as someone who had done something extraordinary. He simply believed that when it came to respecting the fallen, it was a duty, not an option. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that in moments of sorrow and reverence our actions matter, and sometimes it takes just one person to remind us all of the importance of respect.